There is a man you know, or think you know. He lives alone, functions well, speaks clearly, shows up on time, keeps his space in order. Nothing is obviously wrong. In fact, if anything, he seems more composed than most people around him. He doesn't complain. He doesn't ask for much. If you ask him how he's doing, he answers with a steadiness that feels genuine and probably is. But there is something subtle. Something you can't quite name in the first few seconds of noticing it. Maybe it's in the way he pauses before he responds, as if he's translating from some interior language. Maybe it's in the way silence settles around him, without him seeming to notice it at all. It isn't sadness, it isn't coldness, it's something harder to describe, a kind of completeness he carries with him wherever he goes, as if he doesn't need anything he doesn't already have. And that feeling, that strange impression of a man who seems to be entirely enough for himself, is exactly where this story begins, because what has changed in him isn't visible in his behavior. It isn't something you can photograph or measure in a 5-minute conversation. What has changed is something deeper, more structural. What has changed is perception. The way he processes the world, the way he assigns meaning to things. And this transformation happened slowly, quietly, without anyone, including him, fully noticing it as it unfolded. It all begins with something that looks, at first, like an advantage. Silence stops being something to escape. It doesn't happen overnight. It happens in degrees, so gradual that you almost can't track them. In the beginning, living alone has that liberating quality everyone describes. You don't have to negotiate the thermostat. You don't have to justify the hour you go to sleep. You can think without being interrupted. And that freedom, in the early days, feels like exactly what you needed. Silence arrives, and you let it in. The way you open a window for fresh air, you breathe it, it feels good, but then something more subtle happens. Silence stops feeling like an empty space. It starts feeling full of your own thoughts, your own rhythms, your own logic. The mind, without external noise, settles. It deepens. Thoughts become clearer, more continuous, less interrupted. And there, in that clarity, the first invisible shift takes root. Thoughts, no longer being disturbed, are no longer being tested. In a social environment, every thought you express meets resistance. Someone agrees, someone doesn't. Someone reframes what you said in a way you hadn't considered. Someone looks at you with an expression that tells you, without words, that maybe you overstated something, or missed something entirely. That resistance is uncomfortable sometimes, but it's also the force that keeps thoughts from hardening too quickly. It keeps them mobile, elastic. When that resistance disappears, thoughts continue to circulate, but in a closed loop. They reinforce each other. They find internal coherence, and internal coherence, over time, begins to feel like truth. Not because it is truth, but because nothing contradicts it. Certainty grows not from reality, it grows from repetition. And the man living alone doesn't notice this, because the feeling that accompanies it isn't rigidity, it feels like clarity. The brain, in this process, develops something extraordinarily efficient. It becomes both speaker and listener at once. It generates a thought, evaluates it, approves it, integrates it, all internally, without external interference. And what emerges from this process is a self-validation system so fluid, so sophisticated, that the man who inhabits it can no longer distinguish it from simply thinking clearly. This is the part that remains most hidden. It isn't that he stops reasoning. He continues to reason, perhaps better than before. But he reasons inside a circuit that no longer allows for voices that aren't his own. What changes in his behavior at first is almost invisible. Conversations become shorter, not because he has grown cold, but because he has already processed most of what might come up. His responses arrive faster, his explanations become more concise. There is an efficiency in the way he communicates that can seem almost professional, even in personal contexts, as if every exchange were a transaction to be completed in the most direct way possible. Emotional reactions flatten or delay When something unexpected happens, he responds with a calm that can look like maturity, and in part, it is. But in part, it is also something else. It's the absence of that emotional amplification that normally comes from being witnessed. When someone reacts to your reaction, emotions multiply. They feed on recognition. Without that recognition, emotions remain flatter. They don't disappear. They stabilize at a lower frequency. Preferences become more rigid, not as quirks, but as structures. The time he eats, the way he organizes his space, the things he likes and the things he no longer tolerates. Everything solidifies, because nothing disturbs it. No one introduces an element of chaos that forces renegotiation, and so preferences crystallize, and with them, an image of the self becomes increasingly precise, increasingly stable, increasingly difficult to update. Before, meaning was negotiated. Something happened and you discussed it. You interpreted it alongside someone else, and sense emerged from the exchange. Now, meaning is assumed. The event occurs. The mind interprets it. The interpretation settles, and there is no one to say, but couldn't it also mean something else? And then there is the moment when all of this reaches a different level entirely. The moment when solitude no longer simply removes people, but elevates the inner world above the outer one. Thoughts become more detailed than they have ever been. Reflections deepen. Inner narratives develop structure, layers, complexity. There is an almost cinematic quality to his interior life. His thoughts have characters, arcs, their own internal logic. They move with a coherence that makes them extraordinarily convincing. And inside this interior theater, so vivid, so consistent, so immersive, the external world begins to seem, by comparison, noisier, less precise. There is a metaphor that captures something of what happens in this phase. Imagine a floor. In ordinary life, the floor is shared reality, the version of the world that most people inhabit and recognize together. But with prolonged solitude, another floor forms. Higher up, an interior floor built from accumulated perceptions, interpretations, certainties, and this floor rises slowly. You don't notice it rising. You only feel that you're walking with more stability, that the ground beneath you is more solid. What you don't see is that the interior floor has risen so high that you now look at the external world from above, not out of arrogance, simply out of structural habit. At this point, the man doesn't feel isolated, he feels complete. And that completeness, that sense of not needing anything that isn't already inside him, is paradoxically the most delicate point in the entire process. Consider how this transformation manifests over time. In the early stage, the man simply enjoys the quiet. Productivity increases, thinking clears. There is something genuinely positive in this period, and it would be wrong not to acknowledge it. Solitude at this stage seems like exactly what it is. A gift. In the middle stage, things become more subtle. He begins to prefer his own interpretations over those of others, not because he is arrogant, but because his own interpretations are more coherent with the internal system he has built. When someone offers a different perspective, there is a slight friction, not necessarily conscious, but something in him registers that external input as inefficient, as something that slows a process that already works well. Outside feedback begins to feel like noise rather than information. In the late stage, the man no longer seeks correction. And this is the point hardest to see from the inside, not because he considers himself infallible. It isn't arrogance, it is something far more subtle. Nothing seems to be missing. The internal system is so complete, so self-sufficient, that the idea of needing something from outside simply doesn't present itself with the same urgency it once did. There are no obvious gaps that connection might fill, and so connection, rather than feeling necessary, begins to feel optional. These are not three different men. They are the same man, seen at different points along the same path. Reality, through this process, changes in status. It isn't that the man stops engaging with reality. He continues to engage with it, but the way he engages changes profoundly. Before, reality was something to check himself against, a reference point, something that existed independently of him, something he had to continuously negotiate. Now, reality is something to interpret privately, a raw material processed through the filter of his internal system and returned already assigned meaning, already digested. The problem isn't that the interpretation is wrong, often it isn't. The problem is that it is no longer exposed to the test of otherness, and any system, however well constructed, that is never tested from the outside begins to develop blind spots, not because it is flawed, but because no closed system can see its own limits from within. And it is here that something enters. Quietly. A low-grade unease, not dramatic, not anguishing, but present. Like a low sound you only hear when everything else has gone silent. The man is calm, genuinely calm. There is no performance in that calm. It is simply the natural emotional tone of a life that contains few elements of genuine unpredictability. Intense emotions require, to exist in their fullest form, the presence of someone to receive them. They require a witness, and without a witness, they don't disappear, but they quiet down. They stabilize at a lower, more even frequency. This is not peace exactly. Peace implies the resolution of something. What the man experiences is something closer to a reduced emotional dependency on the external world. He no longer needs confirmation from others to feel all right. He no longer needs someone to mirror his joy for him to enjoy it, or to validate his pain for him to process it. He does it all internally, quietly, alone. And this produces something that can feel like an enormous gain. And in some ways, it is. But it also produces something harder to name, a flattening of emotional contrast. Emotions lose sharpness, not because they disappear, but because contrast disappears. The unpredictable element is gone, the moment when another person brings you to feel something you weren't expecting. Without that contrast, emotions become more predictable, more manageable, and less alive. The man feels stable, and he is stable, but he is less moved. Then comes the moment when he re-enters the relational world, and something unexpected happens. Conversations feel slower, not because the people around him are less intelligent, but because the rhythm of another person's thinking doesn't match the internal rhythm he has grown accustomed to. People meander, contradict themselves, repeat, take long roads to reach points he would have arrived at in seconds. And what once felt like the natural flow of conversation now feels not useless exactly, but inefficient. Emotional exchanges feel excessive. When someone brings him a worry or an enthusiasm or a frustration, there is a part of him that receives it, but receives it from behind glass. It isn't insensitivity, it is distance, a distance he didn't consciously choose, but which installed itself quietly as the result of years of internal processing. His system is no longer calibrated for the intense reception of other people's emotional states. It has optimized itself for solitary functioning. People seem unpredictable, not in a threatening way, but in a way that demands an energy he's no longer in the habit of spending. Every relationship carries variables, unspoken expectations, reactions you can't calculate in advance. And that variability, which once felt like a natural part of social existence, now seems to require a non-trivial adaptation. It isn't that other people have changed. It is that his internal baseline has shifted. Relationships once filled gaps. Now, they interrupt a completeness. What does it really mean to be independent? There is a version of independence everyone understands, not depending on others for practical things. Being able to take care of yourself. This version is widely celebrated, and for good reasons. But there is another version of independence, rarer, more ambiguous, born not from the capacity to do things alone, but from the extinction of the need for connection, from the slow, silent disappearance of dependency on the other, not as a practice, but as an experience. And the second version is far more difficult to evaluate, because it carries something genuinely valuable. A man who does not depend on the approval of others is free in a way that many people never experience. He doesn't chase validation. He doesn't modify his behavior based on who is watching. He has an interior stability that resists external pressure. These are real qualities, not illusions, but it also carries something paradoxical. The more complete he becomes in solitude, the less the world seems necessary. And there is a distinction, subtle but real, between choosing solitude because you know how to be with yourself and being unable to fully imagine the value of another person because the internal system has closed around itself. The paradox is this: the more complete you are alone, the less you need the world, and the less you need the world, the more complete you feel alone. It is a self-feeding system, one that closes and consolidates slowly around the man who inhabits it. And all of this unfolds within a culture that doesn't just fail to discourage it, but often applauds it. We live in an era that has built an entire aesthetic around self-sufficiency. The man who needs no one, the radical individual, sealed and complete, moving through the world without being truly touched by it. This figure is celebrated in books, in films, in the philosophies that circulate endlessly online. Emotional independence is sold as the highest form of freedom. Needing someone is reframed as weakness. Vulnerability is treated as a liability to be eliminated rather than a capacity to be preserved. And so the transformation that happens to this man, this quiet, efficient, invisible transformation, is not seen as something to examine carefully. It is seen as an achievement. He is admired in a way that makes it nearly impossible for him to question what has actually happened to him. A man can become perfectly functional and quietly unreachable. And then, one day, something shifts. Not dramatically, not suddenly. There is no single moment of collapse. It happens the way most important things happen, gently, almost imperceptibly, until it can no longer be ignored. Maybe it is a conversation that feels unexpectedly distant, even though he wanted to be present for it. Maybe it is a moment of connection that should have landed, and somehow didn't. Maybe it is standing in a room full of people and noticing, not with sadness exactly, but with a kind of mild surprise, that nothing in that room reaches him the way it once might have. And in that moment, something small but significant occurs. He begins to see it, not the whole picture, not yet, but the outline of something, the beginning of a recognition. What has changed is not the world, and not the people in it. What has changed is his relationship to them. The distance was not always there. The glass was not always there. Something in how he is oriented toward life shifted quietly over time, and he didn't notice, because at every stage it felt like progress. The return from this place is not a dramatic reversal. It is not a decision to give up what solitude gave him. He does not abandon the clarity or the self-sufficiency or the interior richness he developed. What it requires is something more precise, a willingness to reintroduce friction, not chaos, not dependency, but a conscious reopening of the interpretive process to include voices that are not his own, a choice to allow conversations to be slower than his internal rhythm, to sit with the inefficiency of another person's thinking long enough to find what is valuable inside it, to let a feeling arrive from outside, unexpected, unasked for, and to resist the impulse to immediately process it into something manageable, to let himself be interrupted. Not because interruption is inherently good, but because the willingness to be interrupted is a form of remaining open to the world. And a man who is no longer interruptible is a man whose inner life, however rich, has become a room with no doors. Growth in this context is not the loss of independence, it is the recovery of permeability, the capacity to be genuinely affected by something outside yourself, to let reality land, not just interpret it, to allow another person to matter enough to change the way you see something, not all the time, not without limits, but enough to remain, in some essential way, in contact. The man who lives alone is not broken, he is not lost, he has not failed at anything. He has simply adapted efficiently, quietly, and completely to the conditions of his life. But adaptation has direction, and the direction of this particular adaptation, left entirely unchecked, leads somewhere specific, to a place where nothing feels missing, but something important is no longer fully present. Solitude can make a man whole. It can clarify him, strengthen him, return him to himself in ways that no amount of company can replicate. There is real value in what happens in the silence, real insight, real growth. But only connection reminds him that he was never meant to be complete alone, not because he is insufficient, but because the self that forms only in relation to others is a different self, wider and more honest than the self that forms only in relation to itself. That wider version of himself, the one that can be surprised, moved, challenged, and genuinely reached, is worth remaining available to, not by abandoning the solitude, but by staying open within it, by keeping somewhere a door.